Mr. Teresi, nice to meet you. Now, this is your fifth book, the Undead, and you've written others about physics and the history of science, and even a book on the brain. How did you come to write about organ transplantation and death determination?
Well, I wasn't drawn to organ transplantation at all. I was drawn to death. And the reason was I was watching Carl Sagan on the Charlie Rose Show with my wife several years ago in the 1990s. And he announced that he had had this, his second or third bone marrow transplant because of a cancerous disease he had, and it had saved his life. He'd been saved by science. And my wife looked at him and said, wow, he's going to die, and soon. And I said, well, why do you think? He said, well, he looks bad. And second, this is the denial speech, because she had cancer and she was in cancer support groups. And this is the speech you get out of people who are pronounced terminal and they're in denial. He said it's just a classic denial speech. The show finished and they announced that this had been a rerun, that he had died. It had been taped a couple months earlier, and the man who had been saved by science was dead. And he had said an interesting thing in the show, which was, Rose had asked him, what do you think death is? Is it the light at the end of the tunnel, like people like me? He said, no, he scoffed at that. He said, death is a long, dreamless sleep, quoting Shakespeare. And I thought, well, that can't possibly be. Sleep is kind of pleasant. You're breathing, your heart's beating, neurochemical processes are going on, it's invigorating. And this is one of the greatest skeptics of our age, and he thinks that he's just going to be sleeping. And he's not going to be asleep. He's going to be gone. And so what I wanted to do was to try to find out what science said about death and what it was. And I started with a simple question, which is, how do we know when we're dead? And that ended up being the whole book, because that's an impossible question.
Yeah. It is a very difficult question, and I imagine particularly frustrating for someone whose whole professional life has been as a science writer, and someone, again, who's written a book about topics like physics, where at least Newtonian physics used to be pretty straightforward. Granted, when you get into quantum issues, it's more uncertain. But I wanted to just start off, before we get back to this great determination of death, which, as you say, really is the essence of the book, is a little bit more about you and your career, though, as not necessarily a man of science, but a writer of science, I suppose. Tell us about the Omni magazine and Science Digest and other places you've worked in.
Well, I wouldn't say I really haven't had a career. I'm a blue-collar guy who's had a series of gigs and just followed whatever was happening and whoever would hire me, and getting a new job whenever I was fired, which was frequently. But I grew up in Robbinsdale, Minnesota, where some strange magazines were created in the 30s, something called Modern Mechanics. There were all these futuristic magazines that came out of the World's Fair of that era, I think 1932, and during the Depression, when people were so depressed, just financially and emotionally. And these magazines talked about this great future. And I think I was inspired by that, and then inspired by Sputnik, when the country went through a vast educational transformation, where the country was looking for people who were good at math who might somehow beat the Russians in space. And I had the math scores, but not the real talent for it. So I never did do science, but then when I got out of college, I was offered a job at a science magazine, and I took it. And it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing to write about.
And you went from there to co-authoring a book, The God Particle, which was a bestseller in 1993, right?
Somewhere around there. But I had a co-author. My co-author has a Nobel Prize, Leon Letterman. That was a bit of a help, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask you, actually, how did you come to collaborate with him, and what was it like working with a Nobel Prize winner in physics?
Well, he was very funny. And I had interviewed him for Omni magazine, and I'd heard him speak many times, and he was always a big draw at physics meetings, because he was funny and he explained things so well. So I suggested that we should do a book together, and we did. Very easy man to work with, and brilliant, but in a really common man kind of way.
Well, you mentioned humor, and in fact, some of the reviews of that book said it was the funniest book about physics ever written.
That's not a very high bar. You know.
Well, then, but it's even a lower bar than a funny book about death, which is which is what some of the reviews have said as well. What is the role of humor in your writing or in science writing in general?
Well, I think for many people, they feel it shouldn't be a role. Letterman and I were criticized for being funny, that we brought down the field. I mean, I don't believe that. It's just a quirk of mine. I don't think science writing has to be funny or doesn't need to be or shouldn't be funny. It's just the way I happen to write.
Yeah. Well, it was just striking that both books were the humor was remarked upon in both of them. So in writing this book, from one of the themes that seems to pervade is that it awakened in you, or maybe reawakened, seems like a fair amount of anxiety about death.
Oh, yeah.
Say a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that I really didn't think this out. If you think about it, you can't really study death totally scientifically because science is supposed to be empirical, it's supposed to be experiments. But in death, part of the definition of death is that it's irreversible and it's forever. And so when a person's dead, they can't come back and tell you, oh, it was like this. And it's not like going to Philadelphia and they can come back and tell you about it. And if someone does come back, has a near-death experience, well, then they weren't dead because that's part of the definition. So I should have thought that out. But what we're reduced to studying are these sort of netherlands, like netherworlds, like brain death and persistent vegetative state and locked-in syndrome. And it was creepy. It was creepy reading about it and interviewing people about it. And so I started imagining myself in some of these states at time, waking up in the morning sort of terrified, and that trying to tell people I'm really alive in here, and like I was suffocating. I was very influenced by a book called The Bell Jar of the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bauby, who was in locked-in syndrome where you're totally conscious, you have all your mental facilities, but your brainstem is down and you're paralyzed. And here's a guy who wrote a book with one eyelid blinking out a letter at a time. And I had that book, I bought that book, and it sat around for 3 or 4 months before I was brave enough to read it. But it's really a beautiful, that helped actually. That there was this incredible person inside this sort of shell of a body.
Yeah, that is, I remember learning about that in medical school, and I had a patient with it once, and it's a frightening
Oh, you
kind
had a
of
patient?
state. Yeah, with that.
What was it like?
As I said, one can't help but imagine what this kind of thing would be like, and it sounds terrifying. Back to you.
Okay.
Now, you worked in a hospice a bit. I gather
Yeah.
you've done, that's the past. You don't continue to do
Right.
that. Was that part of the research for the book, and
Not
what was
really.
that like?
I was always interested, and it wasn't totally relevant to the book, or I didn't see it as relevant to the book. I wanted to do it. A hospice opened up a block and a half from my house.
Oh.
So I went down there, and they were happy to have me because I was male. It's almost all the counselors are usually women. And there were, among 60 counselors they had, only 2 of us were male. And I've always been interested in death, so I wanted to see what these people were like.
And what were they like?
Well, they actually have a spiritual counselor, a paid person, who's not religious but spiritual, and because you're not allowed to challenge anyone's religious beliefs. And she made the comment once that for most people, they die as they lived. And so it was lovely being with these people, but at the same time, you could see that whatever insecurities they had, they took with them to the grave. If they were shy, they continued to be shy. If they were afraid of opposing authority, they would still be timid around the director. They could be bullied by staff in subtle ways, and bullied by the volunteers in subtle ways. And so who you are is how you die, is what I learned. There were moments. So I did things I wasn't supposed to do. Like, you're not supposed to challenge people. And I had this one patient, let's call him Biff, for lack of a better name. And Biff was always complaining about his wife, who had left him and was not coming to see him in the hospice. And he would just go on every time to me, but what an awful person. And finally I said, look, Biff,